Now that both the IAF and PAF have made formal claims of the others' aircraft, they say they've shot down in the 87-hour predominantly aerial conflagration in May, we can explore some deeper issues. These are not so much to do with the veracity of their claims as with the larger issue. Do these numbers matter? Do these really matter? What do these numbers count for? I can begin this with a trick question. If in a war, one side loses 13 aircraft to combat and the other just 5, who won that war? Let's take a deep breath now, pause and reflect a little bit. All of the active India-Pakistan full-scale wars and conflicts have been short, 22 days in 1965 being the longest. Ops Synindur was just over 3 days. Whenever a conclusive outcome like capitulation and mass surrender is missing, there is scope for both sides to claim victory. That's always happened in India-Pakistan's case, except once. There is clarity in some situations, however. We Indians believe we won every war or skirmish, but accept that we lost in 1962 to China, unfortunately and sadly. Similarly, the Pakistanis concede the defeat in 1971. Their capitulation in the eastern sector was total, top with the surrender and India taking 93,000 prisoners of war. So which Air Force lost how many aircraft to combat in 1971 just in that eastern sector? The numbers established even by rival historians with tail numbers and pilot names are India 13, Pakistan 5. These are losses in combat, and you will see these lists from one of the books I have consulted, that is Eagles over Bangladesh by PVS Jagan Mohan and Samir Chopra, two Indian air war historians. You can see these precise numbers in detail on their charts. These, mind you, are losses in combat, not to accidents or the 11 Sabres and 2 T-33s that Pakistani pilots abandoned on day 5 of the war before making a daring escape to Burma in commandeered civilian transport. Those will be added, but even if you add that, then to all causes also, IAF lost many more aircraft than PAF. Which brings us back to that trick question. At 13 to 5, the IAF lost about 3 times as many aircraft to combat than the PAF in the eastern sector in 1971. So who won that war? Is that even a question? That was as decisive a victory for India as any you've seen in the modern history of war. And how did IAF lose those 13 aircraft? 2. Just 2 were lost in air combat, as 5 of the Pakistani Air Forces were. And the rest to small arms fire from the ground. Small arms fire, some anti-aircraft fire. Why is a good question. Why did IAF lose these aircraft? That's because we told you PAF pilots escaped abandoning their aircraft, and for them the war was over. For the IAF, the war did not end even once the PAF was defeated. In fact, they redoubled close ground support to the army to hasten the victory and minimize the army's casualties, whatever the risk of its own attrition. That's the way the IAF has functioned. 11 of the 13 aircraft were lost to ground fire, mostly flying very low, except maybe one over Tezgaon in Dhaka to anti-aircraft fire. This is the essential difference between the two air forces. One is obsessed with defensive air combat and self-preservation. The other has an all-out aggressive approach as part of the larger national effort. Losses, as Air Marshal A.K. Bharti said in one of his briefings, will take place when you go out in combat. The PAF is numbers obsessed. The IAF is overall outcome oriented. For the PAF and Pakistani public opinion, however, all that matters is how many aircraft they shot down. Not surprisingly, a Gallup Pakistan poll post Ops Synindur showed 96% Pakistanis believe they won the war. The mood has been so heady there that while it is the Air Force that the Pakistanis think won them the war, the army chief is the one who got that ridiculous 5th star. The air chief, already on extension, got a further extension, this time indefinitely. You have to feel for the poor Navy guy. This demonstrates the essential doctrinal difference between the two air forces. The PAF is like a super defensive boxer who, face covered like this with gloves, waiting for the rival to attack and land a punch when an opening arises. The IAF, on the contrary, has a doctrine of all out strikes. It's willing to take the risk that it might have to take a few punches. If the PAF believes in risk avoidance, the IAF is a risk taker, often at the cost of frustrating its fans with early losses. This is therefore an important point to note post Ops Synindur. Historically, the PAF has assessed its performance simply in terms of the score in the air, however the war ended. Its mindset is a limited defensive war against the IAF to inflict attrition. It has historically aimed at that self-limiting objective, while the larger cause is invariably lost. In any war, extended or limited, no Air Force, Army or Navy fights only its counterpart. The key factor is, what were your nation's objectives in the war? What did you do to enable it to achieve them? India's Ops Synindur had three objectives. One, destroy the established and well identified and well known headquarters of the two big terror organizations, Lashkar-e-Taiba at Murid near Lahore and Jaish-e-Mohammed's headquarters at Bahawalpur. Second, deter and defend any counter-strike by the Pakistani forces. All of these three boxes the IAF checked. As several top Indian military leaders have said, there were some losses in the first step, achieving first of these three objectives. For the first and the third operations, it also has high definition pictures and local videos as evidence. What does it tell us about the PAF's psyche? If you've been watching the briefings of PAF, situational awareness has been its favorite buzzword. It will therefore go on and on about its air-to-air claims. In the big picture, it failed to protect any of the predetermined IAF targets deep inside its own territory, Pakistan's own territory, despite 15 days of warning and zero surprise. Forget preventing, it couldn't even interrupt the strike package. Then it failed to protect several critical air defense and surface-to-air missile batteries on May 8 from Harop Harpy drone attacks by the IAF, and with its air defenses either suppressed or switched off in risk avoidance, it went to sleep, sort of metaphorically, in its bunker on May 10. It never rose in combat to challenge scores of IAF aircraft that launched missiles, multiple kinds of missiles, to hit every PAF base, air defense location and critical weapon storage across the entire length and breadth of their country, from north to the south, east of the Indus River and some across it also. You can be sure that if this had gone on for another day, all bases west of the Indus would have been attacked as well. The fact is, the PAF was no longer up for a fight. In fact, the only time the PAF was seen in an attacking mode was before the Indian strikes. It was when the two JF-17s launched Chinese CM-400 AKG anti-radiation missiles to target the S-400 radar or batteries at Adampur. It was a bold raid, but foiled by the IAF defenses. Most certainly it was foiled by the IAF defenses. A bolder, more aggressive and risk-taking Air Force would have dared the IAF with multiple salvos using waves of aircraft, hoping to overwhelm the defenses, hoping that at least one missile will get through and hit the target. But risk-taking isn't the PAF's style. Indian military aviation historians and analysts Pushpinder Singh, Ravi Rikhe, along with Swiss-Australian expert Peter Steinman, describe this unique mindset, this unique PAF mindset in grand detail in their 1991 book, Fizaya, Psyche of the Pakistan Air Force. The PAF, they wrote, has the psyche of a lonely David taking on the IAF Goliath. And if I may add to this on my own, that larger situational awareness, which is their buzzword. The book, very kind to the PAF, very fair. In fact, kind to the PAF is now out of print. Pushpinder or Pushy, who the defense writers and nerds of my generations owe an incredible debt of gratitude for our learnings, passed away in 2021. I thank his son Vikramjit for lending me this last surviving copy of Fizaya. Pushpinder was working on a Fizaya sequel because this is the history of Pakistan Air Force up to 1991. Sequel goes onward from 1991. Vikramjit now tells me that he will bring it out very soon, within weeks in fact, with a chapter on Ops Synindur as well. So please keep an eye out for that. They say the PAF psyche is of seeing their role sharply limited to air-to-air warfare, accepting limitations of their size and counting the score of rival aircraft shot down as the only determinant of success, and then conserving itself for that imagined final phase of the war. This means the PAF fights the IAF in only one dimension and stays on the sidelines of the larger national effort. The country can lose the war, but the PAF would still claim victory because they quote unquote shot down more aircraft. We've seen the pattern play out in 1965 and 1971 and even afterwards post Balakot. Ops Synindur underlines two things. One follows from the other. First, conflicts between India and Pakistan will likely be short, probably even shorter than these 87 hours. Air power will remain central to it. Who lost how many aircraft and which type is so much the 1950s military comic book debate or thinking. The second thing is what contribution you made to the larger national effort. For the second, the PAF has produced not a scrap of evidence or picture after more than 3 months. That's when so much commercial imagery is available and they have access to the entire Chinese spaceware. They found nothing. It's inexcusable where even OSINT operators, OSINT handlers can find commercial imagery. In fact, many of them have found commercial imagery on Pakistani bases. They've looked at Indian bases but found nothing that they can talk about by way of damage. Pakistanis have not even been able to produce a fabrication convincing enough even to partisan Pakistani eyes. Its media, mainstream and social, politicians across all parties, and of course serving military leaders and veterans are all proclaiming a glorious victory. Some are even breathlessly claiming that 1971 is avenged while awarding themselves promotions, medals and honors. It's a widely held belief in Pakistan, in spite of the fact that all of their wanted air bases east of the Indus and some to the west as well were struck by the IAF in its riposte on May 10, once Banyan al-Mursus folded up in failure. As the PAF spokesman confirmed, all of India's missiles were air-launched, which means Pakistan failed to deter any of these IAF aircraft. The IAF strike packages, including multiple aircraft, they aimed and fired at the highly defended Pakistan Air Force bases somewhat at leisure. Because the PAF never rose to defend their bases, they simply wouldn't risk losses, especially with their air defenses either suppressed or silenced in precaution. It was a very different picture from the night of 6-7th May, when the IAF followed severely limited rules of engagement and wasn't permitted to degrade Pakistani air defenses. There are multiple precedents, history and a psyche to this doctrinal difference. The PAF has historically been seen as the tip of the spear by the Pakistani public opinion, though its role in the subcontinent's wars has been marginal. I would go so far as to say no more than an item number. There is a reason for it, and it lies in the numbers. As we go ahead, I will make some purely fact-based statements and list numbers that at the outset will trigger the Indian partisan and cheer fans of the PAF. I will then follow it up with equally factual, rational analysis to show why, while Pakistani partisans draw so much joy from the data points, it's actually a story of enduring pain for them. I borrowed that expression, of course, from the DG ISPR of Pakistan, who grandly threatened India minutes after the initial strike, your temporary joy will turn into enduring pain. I'm obviously flipping it to address it to the Pakistanis instead. Let's look at the data on our air engagements historically. In each case, India has lost many more aircraft in combat than Pakistan. Briefly, if we compile the list now authenticated by historians on both sides with unit, type, tail numbers, crew names, location, and ejected crews taken prisoners of war, the numbers of purely combat losses would be India 52 and Pakistan about 20 in 1965. India 62 and Pakistan 37 in 1971. These are purely combat losses shot in the air or destroyed on the ground by rival air force. Even if you add to the PAF losses the 11 Sabres plus 3 T-33s that they abandoned or destroyed themselves, at least tried to destroy themselves unsuccessfully in Dhaka, the IAF losses to all causes were significantly higher than PAFs. In Kargil, the IAF lost 3 aircraft to Pakistani shoulder-fired missiles, 1 MiG-21, 1 MiG-27, 1 Mi-8 helicopter. The PAF, however, did not join the fight because at that point they knew that the missile gap was in India's favor. Pakistan only celebrated the fact that they had a pilot taken prisoner, Nachiketa. Who won these wars? Answer the question. Pakistan has lost each war it fought against India. I know that Pakistanis have an abiding belief that they won in 1965. My own view goes with the widely accepted wisdom that it was a stalemate. I will also share with you an article that I wrote earlier on the 50th anniversary of that war in 2015, calling it a war of mutual incompetence. You will also see it on your screens. Substantively, however, Pakistan lost that war. They lost the 1965 war because they are the only ones who had a purpose, who had an objective. They started it after long months of planning, and only they had an end game, an end target. With much better NATO weapons and training and Indian forces in the massive post-1962 transition, they were right to think it was their best chance to take Kashmir by force. It was their last, and they blew it. September 6 is when they celebrate their quote-unquote victory in 1965 as the Defense of Pakistan Day. September 7 is observed as the Pakistan Air Force Day. There is a unidimensional PAF element to this because they think that that day they thwarted multiple determined IAF raids on Sargodha and shot down many aircraft. So fanciful is their folklore and so strong the emotion that I wonder why the many rational Pakistanis don't ask that if PAF was so dominant, why did Pakistan not win that war? Good question, isn't it? The tough fact is, September 7 is when Pakistan lost that war. What they had launched with impressive panache as a supposed 1-2 punch, Operation Gibraltar first and then Operation Grand Slam, to take Kashmir in a blitzkrieg, that had failed. Roles had reversed, cause was lost. It was now a war for the defense of Pakistan across the entire frontier. A case of shikari khud yahan shikar ho gaya. Even in the air, that's why it is called Defense of Pakistan Day, because a war to take Kashmir had become a war for the defense of Pakistan. But you know what? Pakistani public opinion would say, whatever the overall result, the PAF did so brilliantly. It's an enduring belief in Pakistan. Was there one big battle where the PAF tilted the balance? I have read almost everything written on that war on both sides. The only example, if we stretch things, would be the PAF slowing the advance of the Indian 15 Division in the Lahore sector. That's a division that went past Wagah and opened a new front there. This allowed the Pakistani army time to reach their own defenses. That 15 division story, however, is recorded differently in India. It's one of the factors in 1965 being the war of mutual incompetence. If the PAF was so dominant, it won't have failed so spectacularly to extricate the pride of their armor from being mauled in Asal Uttar Khimkaran. The fact is that post September 6-7, after the Pakistan Air Force lost 3 Sabres in attacks on Adampur and Halwada, they never raided an IAF base in daylight, an active operational IAF base in daylight. The Boxer now was hanging back on the ropes, hoping that IAF will come deep in their territory and they could fight with home advantage and get kills in tail chases. Again, if you want to read about the air war in 1965 in greater detail, you should read this one, The India-Pakistan Air War of 1965 by P.V.S. Jaganmohan and Samir Chopra. It is so fair and so well documented, including losses on both sides listed like this in this kind of detail, that as an Indian partisan, you could get triggered for a moment. But again, when you think harder, you will see the big picture. Pakistan Air Force was not able to tilt the balance in that war. It failed. The 1971 war is better recorded, and there is no question on who won. Can the PAF by itself claim victory because it lost less aircraft in action? On honest reflection, the Pakistanis would ask, if it had continued going out to fight instead of hanging back in self-defense or self-preservation, would it have contributed more to the national effort? There isn't one instance in 1971 of the PAF tilting the balance in a battle. If anything, it abandoned both its army and navy, reaffirming the reputation of the PAF only fighting for itself, by itself, and almost exclusively in its own airspace. It fights very well in aerial defense, that you have to say. It fights very well in aerial defense. It is optimized for that limited role. Its failures in that war, 71 war, were crippling. The IAF hunters visited Karachi multiple times in daytime, unchallenged over 4 days, lighting up the oil storages, as did the Canberras at night, and meanwhile the Navy also was raining missiles there. The IAF almost single-handedly won the Battle of Longewala, one on which the movie Border was based, and devastated an armored brigade by itself. If only a couple of PAF fighters had appeared overhead, the history of that battle might have been different. All the IAF had were 4 hunters running 2-ship relays, do aaye phir do gaye, from an advanced airfield those days, Jaisalmer, with minimal support infrastructure. To complete the 3-example rule, while the Pakistani army was close to a breakthrough in Fazilka in the Punjab sector in 1971, where India was in such trouble that it had already replaced its 67th Brigade commander for failure, the PAF was mostly missing in action. In each of these 3 cases, it had the ability to shift the weight of the battle, rewrite history, but if it did not do any of that, that's because it wasn't doctrinally primed to do that. In the same war, the IAF took heavy losses from ground fire, mostly small arms, and the first 2, Fazilka and Suleimanki, to buy time for beleaguered Indian Army units. It accepted the losses because the larger cause mattered. In the 62 IAF losses to combat, 17, the largest number for a type, 17 were large and wide, low-flying Sukhoi 7s, all to small arms fire, almost all to small arms fire. There were also 5 slow Mysteers also performing the same role. If the IAF did not flinch, that's because they had a mission. They weren't bean counting. On the contrary, loss/casualty aversion has been central to the PAF thinking. This is passive defense. It minimizes your risks and brings you bragging rights, and your fans will never look at the big picture. The IAF is the exact opposite. It's aggressive, risk-taking, and takes the battle to the enemy's airspace. Again, data, which both sides broadly accept, now tells us that of the aircraft lost in air, either to air combat or ground fire in 1965, the IAF lost 4 times as many over Pakistani airspace than in their own. That means if they lost 10 aircraft, then 8 were in Pakistani airspace, 2 in their own. Again in 1971, that ratio was 5:1. So for any 1 aircraft that IAF might have lost in their own airspace, they lost 5 in the Pakistani airspace. It was because after day 1, the PAF never attacked Indian defended sectors deeper than 50 kilometers, mostly 25 kilometers, in daylight. It merely sat back to defend mostly its own bases. Or Karachi wouldn't be abandoned. Any losses that the IAS then took were over Pakistani controlled territory. In fact, the only loss the IAF suffered in its own airspace was Flying Officer Nirmaljeet Singh Sekhon in Srinagar for his lonely battle with 6 PAF sabres. He was awarded a posthumous Paramveer Chakra. PAF historian Air Commodore retired Kaisar Tufail acknowledges the lonely battle on his blog under the headline a hard nut to crack. Similarly, because the PAF sat back on defense, Similarly, because the PAF sat back in defense, most of its losses were in home skies. Our official history of the 1971 war was never formally released, but it was leaked to the Times of India. And you can find it now in full on the Bharat Rakshak website. It concludes a section on the PAF at the end of that war very fairly with the line,
"In the ring and on its feet."
it was so fair, that line, that Kaiser Tufail used this as the title for his book on the PAF's version of the 1971 war, In the Ring and Up for a Fight. The upshot is, while the IAF had been dominant, but when the war stopped, after 13 days, the PAF still had enough strength conserved in case the war had prolonged. While air-to-air combat always draws much of the attention, the larger dimensions of air power are missed in that excitement. Who shot down how many doesn't really count as much as what was air power's role in the larger national war effort. In any case, if you only indulge in bean counting, you can exaggerate at will. In 1971, by the third day, Pakistan had already claimed 120 IAF aircraft down. I have for you, I can share with you this front page from dawn from the morning of December 5. The harsh truth is, in the biggest battles of both our big wars, the PAF, though sometimes present, did not make any decisive or worthwhile impact, even for its own historians and hagiographers to take note of. Its claims of air superiority remained confined to its own airspace, deep inside its own airspace, and that, any military historian will tell you, is no superiority at all. Armed forces are conservative and rarely shift from their set doctrines even across generations. We saw it from Pakistan Air Force, PAF, in Ops Synindur as well. Once the IAF put it under the pump, it went into the familiar old mode of living to fight another day. The outcome is that the PAF satisfies itself with the relatively juvenile idea of shooting down some aircraft, exaggerating the numbers, and celebrating that in isolation of how the war ended. The IAF has ended up always on the winning side. I went through this history to distill the facts and put the rival post-Sindoor arguments in a fair, substantive perspective. And there is also a postscript to this. If you are interested in a deeper dive, I am listing for you some of my readings for this article. I have taken a close look at serious historians' claims from both sides to arrive at the rival numbers. Since exaggeration of aerial performance is set deep in the PAF psyche, it is likely they will claim their numbers are even better than these. But if they say that, that only makes my point stronger. Then whatever the PAF might have done, it was fighting a war of its own and not contributing adequately or significantly to the national effort. In short, whatever they may have done, theirs is the side that lost the war.